Hello, my name is Andrew Cardozo. I'm president of the Pearson Center, and our session with the minister is delayed by a few minutes. So while we're waiting for him to join us, and he's on his way in to join us, I believe there's a vote in the House of Commons. I'm just going to start with telling you a little bit about what we've got today and tomorrow. And as soon as he comes on, I will leave the scene and my colleagues will take over. I'll just introduce Dave Bulmer, who's President and CEO of AMAPCO, Ontario's Professional Employees, and Indira Naidu-Harris, who is our co-chair. And here we have the minister, so I don't have to rag the puck anymore. We'll get started. Minister, thank you for doing it. I hope we didn't take you away from your ability to vote.
No, I just got it in, Andrew. Can you hear me? Everything okay?
Very well, yeah. So
okay.
We're ready to roll, and I'm going to go off the air. And I'll be back at the end to help with Q&A. And I'll turn over to Dave Bulmer, who will get us started, and Indira Naidu will moderate the session. Thank you, Minister.
And I'll fix my hair. That's the problem with headphones, my goodness. Okay.
Yeah, there's still a couple over there.
On the new challenges for the Canada that we want. Today, we're going to be speaking with the Minister of Labour. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Dave Bulmer. I'm a conference co-chair for this year's event, and I'm the president and CEO of AMAPCO, Ontario's Professional Employees Union. I want to start by recognizing that the Pearson Centre is headquartered on the traditional lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples, and we welcome our speakers and our audience who are joining us from across Turtle Island. I also want to recognize that we meet here today on the National Day of Mourning, and so we remember those who have lost their lives at work. As you may know, the Pearson Centre is a leading progressive think tank that addresses challenging economic and social issues of the day. Pearson is one of the few think tanks that regularly invites representatives from all 5 federal parties, along with business, labor, and civil society leaders and many other experts. As they like to say, they bring people and ideas together. A special thank you to all the donors and sponsors, especially the sustaining sponsors who are Canada's Building Trades Unions, the International Association of Firefighters, and AMAPCO, Ontario's Professional Employees, my union that I'm proudly here representing. And the special sponsors for this conference who are Baylis Medical Technologies, the Hill Times, and the Canadian Health Coalition. Now, just briefly on the format, we have an approximate hour-long session. We're following a discussion for about 40 minutes or so. We'll move to questions from you, the audience. So please send in your questions in the question box available online, and we'll get to as many as possible. And then we plan to end at approximately 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Our webinar today is on labor issues, and we're delighted to have the Honorable Sheamus O'Regan, Minister of Labour, who will be in conversation with us on labor issues facing Canada, his ministry's priorities, and the challenges ahead in the labor market. The minister was first elected to Parliament in 2015 to represent his hometown in the riding of St. John's South, Mount Pearl. He's been a cabinet minister since 2017, serving in various portfolios, including Veterans Affairs, Indigenous Services, and Natural Resources. He was appointed Minister of Labour after last fall's federal election, and in the portfolio, he addresses the issues that are important to all workers across Canada as he works on the federally regulated scene and works with his provincial and territorial counterparts on many important issues of concern to all Canadians. Before politics, he was well known for his 10 years or so as co-host of CTV's Canada AM. And at the moment, I'm also pleased to introduce you to our moderator for this session. It'll be Indira Naidu-Harris. And Indira is Associate Vice President for Diversity and Human Rights at the University of Guelph. She's a former Ontario MPP and minister herself, and is a leading authority on women's issues, education, childcare, and immigration. And like Mr. O'Regan, she was a broadcaster for several years before entering politics. She's an advisory board member of the Pearson Centre and co-chair for this conference as well. With that, I'll turn things over to you, Indira.
Thank you, Dave, for that lovely introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. I can't tell you how pleased I am to be here with you all today for an important conversation about the new challenges for the Canada that we want. Today, our focus will be on labor and the difficulties created for the sector as a result of the global pandemic. You see, whether it's issues about remote work, mental health, sick leave, pay equity, workforce shortages, or the right to disconnect, all of these challenges are part of the labor file and have become front and center concerns for many Canadians. And so a conversation about building a stronger future for all of us post-pandemic must include a discussion about the serious workforce difficulties created by COVID-19 and how we navigate through them. That means it's a demanding time for the Minister of Labour, Sheamus O'Regan. He has been kept busy with the increasing challenges of the file following the global pandemic and the need to strengthen key relationships and build supports in the sector. Minister O'Regan joins us now to talk about his plans for the Labour file as we focus on the Canada we want. Welcome, Minister O'Regan, and thank you for joining us today.
Dear, it's great to talk to you. You are in the enviable position of doing what we used to do as reporters, as journalists, of asking the questions. And let me tell you, having the answers is an altogether different profession and an altogether different skill set. Took me a while to get used to it, I got to tell you.
Well, I understand completely. I've sort of been in your chair myself, and I do understand.
Indeed you have, that's right. Indeed you have.
Minister O'Regan, no question the global pandemic has placed some tough demands on your file. In many ways, much of the future success of our workforce and economy rests on how you resolve some of the biggest challenges to hit the labor file in years, and how you work to build strong pathways, for example, forward for Canadian workers. So tell me, how are you and your team coping with the growing demands on labor, and what are your priorities as the new Minister of Labour in the coming year?
That is an excellent question. I guess how we're coping is by staying focused on what we said we'd do. And the good news is, this is our parliaments are always acrimonious, not necessarily always conducive to, cooperation and getting things done. And yet, I think that there is a growing cross-partisan appreciation of the need to look after workers in this country. Part of it accentuated by labor shortage that we're going through right now. Interestingly, I've got to highlight this. After going through a pandemic for 2 years, and not to say we're out of it yet, but at least we're in a better place than we were. We, not in a million years, did we ever think that we'd be coming out of this right now with 112% job recovery? In other words, we've got 12% more jobs occupied, people working than we had pre-pandemic. That's extraordinary. And frankly, it speaks to the resilience of Canadian workers and to the Canadian workplace and to Canadian employers and employees. So, kudos to everybody for that. I think everybody has had a hand in that. And then, some of the things that we've been able to do, I think paid sick leave, which is something that we said we would do, that we would within the federal, and I should, first of all, spell this out for people. I'm the federal Minister of Labour, and for those businesses that are under the federal jurisdictions, roughly about 5% of the total workforce of this country. For federally regulated industries, you're talking about banking, talk about telecommunications, you're talking about travel, air, marine. So that's, and there's a lot, don't get me wrong, you immediately think of the big companies, but there's a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that are in that jurisdiction, but 95% are with provinces and territories. So within the federal jurisdiction, we said, look, we think that 10 paid days for sick leave is really important. And the reason why we arrived on 10 paid days is because you'll recall from the early days of the pandemic, we were, asking people to stay home for 2 weeks, right? So roughly 10 days. And we got unanimous consent for that in the House of Commons. Now, you appreciate that better than most, right? Unanimous consent from the Conservatives, from ourselves, from the Bloc, from the NDP, from the Greens, from everybody. So, you know, that was a feather in the cap, but clearly a sign that, I think it's recognized broadly the importance of workers in this economy. So paid sick leave. The Prime Minister still has asked me to do work that I had begun as Minister of Natural Resources on what is commonly called just transition. I keep repeating that I don't like the phrase because workers don't like the phrase. We're talking about oil and gas workers and how we make sure that they can continue to lower emissions in the oil and gas field, but also embrace renewables. And it's not easy. We're taking on forced labor, which is something that has also received broad support from all parties. And how do we eradicate forced labor from the Canadian supply chain and make sure that Canadian businesses are operating, abroad, are doing so and practicing best behavior. We are completely embracing mental health as part of the Canada Labour Code. And treating it the same as physical health. And so you can expect to see some movement on that soon. And then, something else I think that's of interest to a lot of people is how do we look after gig workers? I would argue actually increasingly most of us are gig workers, but specifically I'm talking about people who who operate, let's say, as Instacart, Uber. How do we make sure that they have the rights and benefits of other Canadian workers throughout the economy? So some of this we were working on pre-pandemic, some of it has only been accentuated post-ish pandemic.
Yeah, lots of priorities and a lot of different initiatives that you're having to work on. And you actually touched on this a bit, talking about cooperation and getting things done in collaboration. So I want to ask you about that a little bit more. The federal Liberals and the NDP have just come up with a recent agreement. How does that affect your work? You've got so much on your plate. Does it make things easier, harder? How does it work?
Easier. Gives us some stability. I'm a big fan. If you've ever suffered anxiety in your life, I went through a period of anxiety and depression, and if you've ever done that, then you would never want to go back. And what it did, because it happened to me very early, first few months of my political career, is this has become a mission. How do the world is throwing enough anxiety at us. Whether inflation or the economy or war in Europe or coming, pandemic. I mean, we have a saying in Newfoundland where we say, my nerves are rubbed raw. My nerves are rubbed raw. Everybody's nerves are rubbed raw. I mean, Canadians are, so if we can wherever we can find some sort of certainty, wherever we can find some sort of stability, we'll do it. And so, with the NDP, instead of just kind of perennially being on the brink of, oh my gosh, we could be going to an election tomorrow, which does nothing for the nerves, and frankly, doesn't offer, I don't think, time for reasonable policy consideration. So, we come to an agreement with the NDP on things that we have in common, things that we were already working on, paid sick leave, anti-scab legislation, and we came to agreement on something that they, to give them credit, had been advocating for some time, and that's things like, dental care for Canadians. And I give them credit where credit is due. So, as a result now, when it comes to issues of supply and confidence, we have their support until we don't. But, this agreement is pretty solid, and it just allows us time to govern and to be thoughtful. And I do not take that for granted. So I'm grateful.
And what you're really saying is getting the work that you need to get done, and that's fantastic for Canadians, right?
My grandmother used to say, dear, no time for old foolishness. That's what we call old foolishness. Look, partisanship is part of what we do. I'm a Liberal, but I just don't believe in hyper-partisanship or just in when you're trying to govern chronic partisanship. People elected me to work, to do the job, not to be up to old foolishness, as my nan would say. So I'm happy about this.
So you touched on something that I really want to talk a little bit more about. In fact, you touched on it in several ways, but you talked about anxiety of the times, the pandemic, and what it's really done to regular folks. And after all, it's been an extraordinary 2 years, lots of unique challenges created by the pandemic, serious inequities, and also, folks like you are trying to find solutions and some serious challenges, workers talking about experiencing burnout, wanting to resign from their jobs, taking stress leaves. I mean, the list is long, and what's become very clear to all of us is that perhaps one of the biggest impacts of this pandemic has been on mental wellness. You've been outspoken about the need for mental health support. So, tell me about that. What can you do as Minister of Labour to help workers and get them the supports that they need?
Well, you got 500,000 Canadians miss work each week due to a mental illness. You think about that, 500,000 every week. So I think, I was involved in the Bell Let's Talk campaign for quite some time, and in fact was an advocate and an ambassador for Bell Let's Talk before I went through had my own mental health issues, ironically. But I knew, from years of being a journalist, how important it was. And I think, in my years at Canada AM, me and my co-hosts, Bev Thompson and Jeff Hutchison and Marcy Ian, who's now Minister Marcy Ian in the cabinet with me, but we ourselves around the table, as we were discussing stories, we had recognized that what was coming out was mental health issues, and we really worked very hard on our show to really bring people out into the spotlight, to support them, to allow people to tell their stories, and that's work that carried over with me here. And so I'm, this is something I feel very strongly about, making sure that people have those supports. So we're making mental health a component of workplace health and safety, which is a seismic shift. So what you're talking about, we will be considering injuries associated with mental health. They'll be covered by occupational health and safety requirements as much as physical injuries, right? And this is important because, look, just by not addressing this, the Canadian economy loses an estimated $6 billion every year in productivity. 1 in 3 workplace disability claims in Canada right now are related to mental illness. So, it's important to do from an economic point of view. It's also important to do from a moral point of view. I mean, this is what we do. We look after one another. And there is a growing illiteracy now, much more than when I started on Canada AM and we were making these editorial decisions and trying to make these stories come out into the light. In these past 20 years, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary, especially to me when I talk to young people who just take it for granted, not take it for granted, but just understand its importance and have far greater literacy and far greater abilities to talk about it, where it was, not to disclose your age, but I mean, I'm old enough that I know what it is to live with shame about these things. And we are getting rid of that, and that is extraordinary. We've still got a lot of work to do. Don't get me wrong, but it's I know, because it's within my lifetime, how far we've come. One, I think, particular manifestation of this that we have seen, particularly during the pandemic, is the right to disconnect. What does it mean to be at work? Because that has changed now dramatically. How many times in the last 2 years has your home become a workplace, right?
Yeah.
Your kitchen table, your couch. I have to admit, on a couple of occasions, my bathtub. What is the ability and sometimes the expectation to be constantly connected? That'll rub your nerves raw. And in politics, we won't better than most. It's kind of like the 24-hour news cycle, the 24-hour Twitterverse. But this is affecting people who did not, who enjoyed maybe an 8 to 5 or 8 to 6, but they hadn't given hours. And now suddenly it's all over the place. So we want to explore. We're talking to unions and employers and some NGOs. They're serving on an advisory committee. And we're going to be releasing a report on a worker's right to disconnect. And I think that at the very least, what this is starting to do is open up a conversation. And, I think people should embrace these conversations at their own workplaces. And these are conversations you need to have with your employer. So we want to begin that.
Very important conversation to have in families and with your employer, and certainly for our communities to be having. And I'm glad you touched on that, actually, because that is one of the items in your mandate letter from the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister actually included a long list of expected deliverables for you, everything from mental health, sick leave, pay equity, fairer collective bargaining, and, as you mentioned, the right to disconnect.
Yeah.
It's a lot. What did you think when you saw the letter, and how are you planning to work through all of those commitments?
Yeah, well, in my previous portfolios, he has done the same thing to me. I mean, it's good. he demands lots from the people he chooses when he puts them in these portfolios. At Veterans Affairs, I had to bring back a lifelong pension because our veterans weren't receiving that any longer, and we did that, and then we also put in an education and training benefit that is quite lucrative, I think, for people who are willing to serve and want to think about what their career will be afterwards. Indigenous Services. This is, I grew up in the North and have worked in negotiations on land with Indigenous peoples when I worked in the provincial government. This is something that I felt very strongly about because that disparity is something that I grew up with, or I shouldn't say I grew up with, but I could see it. These were people I went to school with, and their communities were not the same as my community.
Yeah.
And Natural Resources Canada, we had a fairly lengthy list of just how we were going to deal with lowering emissions and building up renewables and looking after our workforce and the competitiveness of our natural resources sector and mining and forestry. And in the middle of that, the pandemic happened and an oil price war. And these aren't small things. We're the fourth biggest producers of oil and gas in the world. It's not something that we think about, but we are. And so getting these things right were incredibly pivotal to the economy. We managed to navigate that. And so I think now with Labour, yeah, he's given me a fairly lengthy list. I've spent a lot of time over the past couple of days with the Canadian building trades unions right across this country. They've been meeting here in Ottawa, so I've been spending a lot of time with them. And these are the men and women who get things done. I mean, when we talk about the housing crisis, who do you think is going to build the houses? When we talk about lowering emissions, who's going to lower the emissions? So I feed off them, and the list that I gave you, I'm working on all of them. These are all the priorities. There are a whole host. I mean, if you talk to any union leader in this country, this is only the tip of the iceberg. But these are things that we've really focused on. I will add one thing that and this came out of the budget. I'm very happy about it. A labor mobility tax credit, tax deduction. And that applies as of this year, because look, you got labor shortages in different parts of the country, and yet the ability of workers to actually fly to where the job is sometimes hindered, and they're expected to take up those travel costs themselves. And we're saying, look, you can deduct that at tax time because we need you to move around the country. We need you to be able to fill those jobs. That was a big deal. They've been asking for that for a long time, and it just makes all sorts of sense. So I was very happy to see that in the budget.
And let's talk a little bit more about some of those directives. As you mentioned, you were at Canada's Building Trades Union annual conference yesterday, and I think you touched on the labor mobility tax, but you also mentioned earlier oil and gas. So let's go to another item in your letter, just transition, which you touched on earlier. Plans for oil and gas workers to essentially help them transition from the work that they've been doing in a low carbon economy. Not an easy challenge. It will involve retraining, supports, a change in culture, really. So, what kind of a time frame do you have for this legislation, and what are your plans, and where are you at?
Well, I think I actually spent some time speaking to workers and kind of lowering their anxiety level. Look, the first thing that we got to get straight is that there's no master plan. Government doesn't have some master plan for this. What I do know is what our goal is, and what I do know is the urgency of it. So, in other words, we have to start lowering our emissions urgently and immediately, but we have to do it effectively. Because, as I said, Canada is the fourth biggest producer of oil and gas in the world. And I think that where government has often gotten it wrong is that we haven't done enough to thank the workers who have created this industry. Regardless of how you feel about the oil and gas industry, the fact of the matter is it's the biggest in the country. It's our biggest export. And it touches every part of the country. Now, in places where I grew up, where I represent, where I live in Newfoundland, believe it or not, we are more dependent on oil than Alberta. So I got skin in this game. I got to make sure that my province is okay, that my workers are okay. Not more than okay. I want them to prosper. And Alberta and Saskatchewan are the other ones. People who live in these provinces generally, they can see where it comes from. They have an appreciation for its importance to our economy. But for many people in Canada, they don't, just because there's no proximity. They don't see it. But it's much more than, this is a problem or this is a challenge. I'm telling you that this is the challenge for the country in the next 20, 30 years, is trying to figure a way out of this. I also say to my colleagues, you know, because just because I constantly point out obstacles doesn't make me an obstructionist. It just makes me, it makes me a Newfoundlander.
Yeah.
You grow up in a rock in the middle of the Atlantic, you see the world for as it is. And the fact is, this is a monumental challenge. What we need from workers is they're the ones to do this. This isn't something that we kind of like look after them like it's some sort of charitable thing. Who do you think is going to lower the emissions? Who do you think is going to build up the renewables? We need them. And one of the things that we've gotten wrong, I think, is that sometimes we have not lowered the anxiety level amongst workers, nor have we told them that we appreciate their work. We appreciate what they've built in this country, but all that hard work, all that ingenuity, all that expertise and experience, all that sheer bloody mindedness that they showed in building our oil and gas industry in this country, we need you now. We need all that, and we need it right now in lowering emissions. This is urgent business.
And
You
and that
cannot lose sight of workers because they are the ones who do the work.
And that conversation is happening right now as we see things happening in the broader geopolitical context around the world, and seeing a refocusing of that sort of power struggle in terms of oil and gas, and where countries are looking at in terms of the next options that are out there. So it's a complicated matter, isn't it?
Yeah, so step one, welcome workers. Make them feel appreciated. Make them feel part of this mission, right?
Yeah.
Don't pat them on the head and say, you know, okay, we're going to just have this just transition. I don't even know what sometimes that means, because if you got to give it some thought. It requires work. Everything requires work. So, we need them. They are the ones who will do what we've asked them to do. 30, 40 years ago, we asked them to create an oil industry in this country. We asked them to figure out how to get oil out of sand. They did that. But now we know, the emissions that this is causing. We know, how devastating it is as we try and mitigate climate change. So we got to change. But these are the people who do the work. So we need to embrace them. We need to arm them properly to make sure that, in places where they can move over. Some of them, can move over renewables. So the problem is renewables, unlike most of the oil and gas industry, or the big companies anyway, they're not necessarily unionized jobs, and they don't necessarily pay as well. So we got to rectify that. I mean, this is basic stuff.
Yeah.
But I think right from the get-go, one of my first big jobs is just to make them feel welcome and appreciated, and tell them, okay, we need you big time. That'll be a good first step. But this is going to be a long, long process, and it's going to take some time. But the work has got to begin now, because we've got to meet our targets for a whole host of reasons. First of all, the moral and existential reason we got to avoid the worst effects of climate change. But also because it's the right thing to do, both morally for the hundreds of thousands of people who are involved in this industry in this country. Morally, it's important, and economically, it is absolutely vital. It is absolutely vital for the competitiveness of our energy industry. But here's the good news. The world's watching us. I mean, I've been involved with the International Energy Agency and the G20 and the G7 for some time as an energy minister, natural resources minister. And people look to Canada because they know we know how important this is to do. They know that we have the will and that we want to do it. And they know we get how important it is. And that we've got the ingenuity and the wherewithal to do it. So we got to get busy. But the world is watching. And I think that, frankly, in the same way that we built this industry, we can pivot it. We can change it fundamentally. We've got some exciting opportunities ahead of us, particularly in hydrogen. But, you look at provinces, there are a lot of untold stories out there. Alberta leads the country in wind and solar.
Yeah.
By far.
Lots of stories, for sure. And, I'm going to leave this topic for a bit now and go to something you touched on a little earlier, which was talking about welcoming workers and making sure that they were comfortable. We also talked about the pandemic and serious inequities in our society being exposed. Part of the conversation that you're having about this has to do with employment and employment equity, I should say. That piece was implemented over 35 years ago. There's still a lot of work to do, as we all know. So tell me, how key is employment equity, in our workplace culture, and how does it affect our performance right now? And what needs to happen? There's a bit of heavy lifting that needs to happen in the next little while. Where are things at with this?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you from my time at Natural Resources, too many of our natural resources are still dominated by white males. Um, and what I say is, if we don't really get inclusivity right, then we're not getting the best people. That's
Hmm.
primarily number one. Aside from the fact that I think, we need to make sure that everybody has equal access to work and people have a right to do that in this country. You're just not getting the best people. That's what I say to businesses. Regardless of where you fall in this issue, it's a competitiveness issue as well. But we're actively promoting equality. Whether it's proactive pay equity legislation, pay transparency, through our accessibility legislation.
Hmm.
So, budget 2022, we're investing about $2 million to complete the Employment Equity Act review, and that's going to be happening in the next few months. We have a task force that's working on a review of that act. And they're now moving to the next phase of the review, which is, you consult with stakeholders, with members of designated groups in some communities, women, LGBTQ2 Canadians, Indigenous peoples, Black and racialized Canadians, persons with disabilities, other underrepresented groups. And the task force is going to hear about their lived experiences and how that has shaped how they view employment equity. Today is actually the last day for Canadians and for stakeholders to share their views on the review of the Act. And they
Oh,
can do it if they want by going, I don't want them to leave this, but if they're so inclined, they could go to the consultation webpage. And the engagement period is expected to end in the summer of 2022, and then they'll be recommending how we amend the Act. And I think, if a renewed Act, Employment Equity Act, I think it'll help contribute to a more vibrant and diverse workforce. I think it's, and ultimately that will help us build a better future for Canadians that is equitable and inclusive and
yeah.
fair. And I think ultimately more prosperous.
So if we talk about that, let's just go to what seems like a natural segue here. Census data released yesterday talking about, Canadians aging, essentially our workforce aging. We've always known that we need to build a future workforce for Canada that would possibly mean looking outside of our borders and making sure that we were being inviting to more diverse communities and
Mhm.
engaging some of those communities from outside our country and certainly inside. How does that play into your ministry right now when it comes to labor? How the notion that the workforce is aging, we may have to look at older workers, but we're also looking, as you said, at equity to make sure that those folks that we're bringing in from elsewhere will feel comfortable. Important priorities right now?
And beyond just me, something that is occupying several government departments. But I would say, most particularly, I'm working with Minister Carla Qualtrough, who's the Minister of Employment,
Yeah.
and Minister Sean Fraser, who's the Minister of Immigration. We have. Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's really important to note, we're bringing in now well over 400,000 new Canadians every year.
Hmm.
We are bringing in a record number of immigrants every year. In fact, I would argue per capita, there's probably no other country, comparable country in the world that is as open to immigration as we are. And I think Canadians should be commended for that, because there aren't many countries in the world that are as good as we are with all the difficulties that we have, and there's plenty, lots of room to complain on the immigration front. But you'd be hard pressed to find another country that deals with it as well as we do. It is always difficult when you bring in new people and hundreds of thousands of new people every year into an established economy and society, and trying to find room for everybody. But I don't know of another country that does it as well as we do. So, I always stop at that, early on in an answer to this question, because I think it's important that we note that we're
Hmm.
so we're so Canadian most of the time, and not giving ourselves a bit of praise. And that in no way means that are any more lackadaisical about, or that we're ones to sit on our laurels. We never are. But it's important that we note that we're not perfect, but by God, we don't mind trying to become perfect. Um, I think one of the big, if I was going to encapsulate one thing, it would be the issue of temporary foreign workers,
Yeah.
which is something that we have in this country, and bring people in to do a lot of jobs that, frankly, we just can't find Canadians, people who are living here, to do. You look, I think of particularly farming, but I'm looking at, in my own riding, fish plants. It's tough work. The workforce in a lot of these industries is getting older and older quickly. We do have a labor shortage, and in skilled labor we do. Sometimes we can start training people, and we are, and unions, provincial governments, and the federal government are working in concert together on how we get, let's for instance, more skilled labor in this country. That's going to take time though. When we can bring people in to do some of this work. Some of it is manual labor, but it's important work that needs to be done. And how do we make sure that these people are treated with dignity? And how do we make sure that there's also a pathway to citizenship for them? That's the difference. I mean, for too long, to be honest with you, they were not treated with dignity, and there was not a pathway to citizenship. So, these are things we're working on, but it is a big issue for the economy as a whole. The labor shortage that we're suffering is now, which means that we have to we have to alleviate it now. And that is not easy, but that's, as they say often, that's a whole of government approach, but particularly for Carla, Sean, and me.
Well, and such an important topic as we look at building and rebuilding really post-pandemic and how we go about doing that. And this is absolutely a priority. And let's face it, Canada is in competition with many other countries in this area. Lots of other countries out there are looking at that labor market that goes beyond their borders. Indeed. And how to engage people. It's competitive. And I agree with you that Canadians we need to get better at selling ourselves as the place of, the destination of choice, so to speak. And bringing people on board with us. I'm going to change the subject a little bit now. I mean, you're the Minister of Labor, so back to work legislation. I'm sure this is a topic that probably keeps you up late at night. You've got a strike, you might have, a lockout, and then you have to come up with a decision that strikes the right balance, right, between the needs of the workers, the rights of the workers, and then making sure that Canadians get those ongoing essential services. There was a recent strike action at CP Rail in March. What goes through your mind? Yeah, as Minister of Labor, what goes through your mind when you're grappling with some of these difficult decisions, and how do you navigate through that?
Well, let's see. On the CP rail strike, I mean, I have to tell you, I understood the importance of the rail network to this country and to the economy. But after my tenure as Minister of Natural Resources, I really began to appreciate. I mean, this is how goods and many goods in this country are transported. But because they're transported in places that we don't see, and often in rural parts of this country, you just don't see those trains go by, and you have no idea how much the economy relies on them. And it does. And so, look, I can, even on the CP rail strike, I can tell you, I had in the last week when, it was just so close. Yeah. I had the U.S. ambassador calling me and texting me. I had the U.S. Secretary of Labor calling me and texting me. They were just like, how are things going? They were just checking in, because this is so incredibly important to the American economy. Our rail, with our biggest trading partner, is like a major artery with a whole bunch of capillaries that are going all through the continent. And so this becomes a competitiveness issue for the United States. Anyway, look, on back to work legislation and stuff, you got to remember, first of all, the union has the right to strike, right? This is in the Canada Labor Code. As well, an employer has the right to lock out its employees, and that's in the Canada Labor Code. They're both protected. So, you got to respect that. And you got to let the process play out. You got to know your role. The parties, the employer and the employee, the employer and the union, when they're negotiating, they have a responsibility to make the compromises that are necessary to reach a deal as soon as possible, and therefore avoid those major impacts to our economy. And so it's my job really to remind them of that, to reassure the country that we're on top of it, and to keep them at the table, no matter how raucous it may get. We've got this crackerjack mediation team. They're like the Avengers of mediation. They're amazing. Like, they could do a movie on these people. And they know what they're doing. And they're professionals. And they will outlive me and the next minister and the next minister, just as they did the previous ministers to me. They're the best in the country. So I would receive updates from them twice a day. I was close. I was at a neighboring hotel in case I had to actually bust into the room very dramatically. I didn't have to do that. I didn't have to do that.
Maybe wearing your little cape or whatever, and
I wish it worked that way. It'd be a lot more exciting. But fortunately it doesn't. My job, as I saw it, was to let my team do the work, and I knew that anything that I said or did publicly will impact the negotiations. So I had to be very, very careful in what I said. I didn't want to change that table, because the second you start talking about back to work legislation, you change the dynamic at that table. So I couldn't even talk about it. You just let that process to play out, and it's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's very important that you respect both sides and that they come to an agreement. But here's where it's, I think, of interest to most people, and it's not just esoteric. If they reach an agreement on their own, that's the more lasting deal.
Yeah.
When you force a deal on them, if you're back to work legislation, it doesn't last as long. And so, you could be back at it in another year or two. I want a deal that lasts. I want a deal that's arrived at by them making the necessary compromises they need to make, so we don't have to go through it again. Now, having said that, I'd like to explore all sorts of ways, respecting the rights of either side. Is there other things that we could be doing to make sure that there is greater stability in the industry, that there is greater certainty, so that we don't have to worry about this all the time? I want to explore those options. But it's protected in the Canada Labour Code. Employers have the right to lock out their employees, and employees have the right to strike.
Getting ready to wrap things up, but there is an area I did want to touch on before we do that, and that has to do with workplace harassment and violence. This is an area where I know you've been doing a lot of work. So tell me, how serious is this problem in your eyes in Canada, and what steps are you taking to build the right work environment for workers?
I think it's significant, and I think it comes back to what I had said before too about mental health. There is a greater literacy now, a greater appreciation. People have a greater appreciation for their rights. Women have a greater appreciation for what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And an increasing number of men are also learning that. And the same goes for, racialized Canadians. Same, I would argue, goes for LGBTQ2+ Canadians. I mean, you don't put up with it anymore. No. So how do we, and again, I look at my role as twofold here. How within, those businesses that are within federal jurisdiction, how do we make sure that we're looking after the rights of employees there? And that is, that's work that's ongoing. It's also ongoing, I should argue, on an international level through something called so this is a group that I'm a member of, the International Labour Organization, which was set up by the United Nations based in Switzerland. And we're working on a resolution right now that would protect the rights of workers from harassment at the workplace all around the world. And we're trying to figure out tangibly how that will help people on the ground. The second role I would have, besides being Minister of Labour for those businesses and employees that are under federal jurisdiction, is I think a leadership role for the other 95% that are covered under the provinces and territories. I mean, I have a very good working relationship with all the ministers of labor and the ministers responsible for labor right across Canada, and this is something that we're working on together to make sure that regardless of jurisdiction, people are protected and looked after. So I would say watch this space, because again, Canadians are telling us this is important, because fortunately, in 2022, more workers have a greater appreciation for what is acceptable and what is no longer acceptable.
Yeah, and that has become so true, especially during the pandemic, right? People's sensitivities and really their patience with what they're willing to accept and put up with has really changed.
And what happens in a labor shortage, and when we're dealing with a very high employment rate, is employees are empowered.
Yeah,
they're empowered. You better give me a decent work environment, or frankly, you're just not getting me.
Yeah. That's true. Absolutely. Okay, final question before we go to Andrew Cardozo, who's going to be bringing some questions from the audience for us. But, when you think about labor challenges, building the Canada we want, which is what the series is all about, What do you think we need to focus on in labor, Minister O'Regan?
The workers.
What do we need to do? Okay.
I think, again, I'll bring it back to, what we call just transition. I keep saying I hate the phrase because workers hate the phrase, but people know what I mean when I say that. It's internationally recognized. How do we make sure that energy workers and energy producing regions are looked after? Energy and oil and gas particularly drives this country, drives the economy of this country. I think that, too often when I say that, people seem to think or imply that what I'm saying is, well, we can't do anything about it or the status quo applies. Furthest thing from the truth, actually. I just don't believe in blindly doing stuff. I do believe in being very effective and clear-eyed. In order to be effective, you got to be clear-eyed. And so I'm just saying it's a huge challenge. One of the first things we can do is make sure that workers feel included. Because they're the ones who do the work.
Yeah.
Anything that we are talking about right now, whether it be the climate crisis, whether it be the housing crisis, whether it be coming out of a pandemic, all of this require how we deal with climate, how we deal with housing, and how we deal with COVID comes down to workers. And maybe it's a good time for me at the tail end of this Q&A session with you just to tip my hat once again to healthcare workers in this country. And what they have been through, right from nurses and doctors to contact tracers. They got us through this. It's incredible, and how we treat them, and so much of what I do, whether I'm talking about mental health or employment equity or harassment at the workplace, I'm always thinking first and foremost of healthcare workers. And I have to admit, partial bias. I'm the son of a nurse, full disclosure. And once you're a son of a nurse, you're always the son of a nurse. And I think of my mom, I think of the different work environment that she had, but I have a great appreciation for the work that her and her colleagues do. When I think of, how we have gotten through this, even now, I put on a mask because even in areas where I know, you don't have to wear a mask, I think that, if the bug is passed on to a healthcare worker, and we need every one of them, and I don't need them burned out. Right. So they are top of mind for me all the time.
No question. It's been a challenging time for them, and they've really been amazing through this entire process and have carried us all through this difficult time. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you and looking forward to hearing some of the questions that the audience will have for you through Andrew Cardoso, who is our president. But it's been a real honor to speak with you today.
I appreciated it. Thank you.
Thank you, Indira Naidoo-Harris, and thank you, Minister. Just a few quick questions before we close up. And first, I just want to say on the nurses and first responders, apart from the fact that they were there, as you know, saving us, they had to wear that dreadful PPE every day.
That's how
experience. I hate wearing it for 10 minutes. I can't imagine wearing it day in and day out.
Yeah, I agree.
Very, very difficult, but they did it because of their dedication. So the first question is regarding just transition.
Yeah.
You indicated that there is no master plan. Would there be less anxiety for workers if there was a master plan, including one for the downstream workers?
I think that the first thing, and I said this to the CBTU yesterday, the Canada Building Trades Union, we're not doing anything without you. They'll always say we need to be at the table, and I'm like, you are the table. This is the table. I pointed at the union, at the groups that I was speaking to. I said, this is the table. There's nothing happening without speaking to workers. How the heck you think you can do anything on the immense decades-long work that we are going to have to do to lower emissions and pull up renewables in this country, and do it without workers? And the only way you're going to do it with them, and it's back to the larger point that I was just saying to Indira. Right now we're in a labor shortage. Demographically, we know that this is going to be an issue as well. Even with the rapid influx of immigrants to this country, it's going to be very difficult to keep up. So they have to be included, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because we need them. None of this gets done without them. I think that just gets lost. So many times in talking about just transition or lowering emissions, we just say, well, just go do. I get tweets that say, well, just you haven't done the just transition yet. That's this is decades. But what it does, look, let's look at methane right now. Methane is something that we know that we can do right away, which is it's a particularly bad greenhouse gas. And you know, we are right now like, how do we lower methane? Sometimes it's a matter of tightening the screws. Well, who knows where the screws and bolts are, the nuts and bolts, you know, like, you know, it's the workers who are out there already. So the first thing you need to do is lower their anxiety level and say, look, a lot of what we are asking you to do is not going to be that much different than what you're doing already, right? Particularly when I look at how huge hydrogen is going to be in this country. I helped, when I was Minister of Natural Resources, draft a hydrogen strategy for this country. And you know, we're looking at some that's based more off natural gas, and we're looking at, you know, more off hydroelectricity. Natural gas maybe in Alberta and Saskatchewan, hydroelectricity in British Columbia, Newfoundland, Labrador, Quebec. You know, if you look at how hydrogen is derived and how it is shipped, it doesn't look all that much different, to be honest with you, from what we're doing right now with oil and gas. So, you know, a lot of this is going to be some skills training and some and pivoting over to a different assignment, but it is not going to be fundamentally different from what they were doing before. You know, the thing about renewables is we're going to need workers in order to build them, but you don't need as many people to maintain them, right? So, you know, that's the issue with renewables, but there are a whole host of other things like carbon capture and sequestration, which, by the way, is a proven technology. And it is something that is happening in other jurisdictions around the world, and it is happening on a smaller scale in Canada, but we're going to need to bring it way up. And the easiest way to describe carbon capture is, as the Norwegians put it, and their offshore carbon capture is world leading, is you're putting the carbon back where it came from. So the places where you drilled up the oil and you took the natural gas, you're putting it back down there and you're putting a stop on it. That's a vastly oversimplified explanation of what CCUS is. But it's something that we take very seriously. This is all of what I'm talking about is complex engineering. All of this requires people who know what they're doing, and workers are the ones who know what they're doing. So this will be a constantly evolving process. It is going to evolve, not, you know, everyone just kind of points at government, but it's going to be government, unions, and it's going to involve the companies themselves. Yeah. Because they are going to need to retain these workers in order to continue to be competitive. And just quickly, as one example of that, look, during the middle of the very beginning of the pandemic, when we suffered two crises in the natural resources industry, not just the pandemic itself, but an oil price war with Saudi Arabia and Russia, where everything doubled. I remember looking at the price of oil turning into -35. That is not good news for this country, and immediately getting on the horn to the Alberta energy minister. So what did we do? We thought, employee retention. I needed to make sure that oil and gas workers didn't leave the industry, because we need them to lower emissions and build up renewables. So we put billions of dollars towards cleaning up orphan wells and inactive wells, because this was stuff that they knew how to do, and that would be good for the environment. And would, at least until we knew what was happening with the industry, would retain them. And now, the industry has come back. We didn't know that then. But I'm driven to make sure that we lower emissions, build up renewables. I need workers to do it. Anything I could do right away to make sure that they were retained and held in the industry at a time when we are experiencing a chronic labor shortage.
Yeah, thank you for that. We had a webinar on just transition last week as part of this conference, and I guess my next question piggybacks a bit on that. Is there a sense that the workers who would lose their jobs over the next few decades in oil and gas, that number could actually move into new technologies, minus, say, the number of people who will be retiring?
I got to tell you, my biggest issue is making sure I have enough people. Whether it be on CCUS, whether it be on hydrogen, whether it be on lowering emissions within current energy sources, my biggest issue is making sure we have enough people.
Okay.
So there seems to be this, and I really got to dispel this notion that we're moving over to renewables and it's all just going to. That is not. This is going to be a lot of hard work, and within the oil and gas industry itself. Oil is going to be with us for some time. We just got to make sure that when we get it, it is the lowest emissions profile that we can possibly get. Some of that's going to be tightening screws and lowering methane levels. We're eliminating it altogether, and others it's going to be looking for sources where inherently when we get them at source, the oil is got fewer emissions than would otherwise be the case. And I would also just add this. we point to the supply side of oil and gas. We don't point as often to the demand side, although we are covering that. The fact of the matter is we all, in some way, consume it, right?
Yeah.
But we are working on that. And I mean, we're getting rid of internal combustion engines, new internal combustion engines in this country by 2035. Moving over to EVs, we're very serious about it. We've put a new focus on making sure that we mine the critical minerals in this country in order to put them in the batteries that will power the EVs. We want to build the batteries in this country. We want to build the EVs in this country. And we've begun that. We're investing billions in that. So, we got to look after the demand side too.
Yeah, and then ensure that there's enough energy for those EVs.
Exactly.
We have enough grid. Just a quick question on one more on just transition. Are you looking at legislation as part of that?
Yes. We are, and hoping that we will have that done this year. I think the one thing I've learned about Ottawa in my tenure here is that nothing focuses the mind like legislation. Nothing focuses the mind like legislation. Regulation, close second, but legislation primarily. So look, it's a good opportunity for all of us to put our heads together and figure out what the foundation will be here. And I think, set the parameters for what we want to do. Primarily is cooperation between employers, employees, and the government. And I think having, the best minds in the country working on this, we have so much riding on making sure that we get this right, the overall energy transition of this country, so that, we're lowering our emissions and that we're meeting our targets.
Yeah, okay. There's one quick question on a sector we haven't talked about, which is middle skilled jobs and let's say lower skilled jobs. Is that part of the plan for the revitalizing the economy?
Andrew, maybe you could tell me what you mean by middle level or lower skill level jobs.
Not explain too much, but let's just say for the non-high skilled worker, say people with middle level skills or low levels of skills, is there a future for them in the rebuilding of the economy?
Oh, most definitely. So I think that, there are a few things that you can do there. You can make sure that they're part of the, the minimal social safety net that we have in this country. And that's why we're looking at gig economy workers. How do we make sure that people who drive your Uber or deliver your groceries through Instacart, or, deliver your takeout from Skip the Dishes, how do we make sure that they have the bare minimum of, contributing to UI, CPP and some basic, medical benefit? So, I think that's one thing that we can do. And I think, wherever you have universal programs, that's where you make sure that everybody benefits. And I think, frankly, one of the most seminal things that this government has done is childcare, and making sure that we have affordable childcare right across this country, so that regardless of what your skill level is, or regardless what job you hold in the grander pecking order in this country, that you are treated, with dignity, and that you have a chance at moving up if you choose to move up, or stay where you are if you love your work, but that you have an opportunity to live your life with dignity.
Thank you. We had this afternoon, Indira moderated a discussion with Margaret McCain, who's done an awful lot of work in childcare. So this is a good connection to that discussion. I just want to remind our audience that we've got one more session in our conference tomorrow, which will be on new sectors of the economy for tomorrow's economy. We'll have Brian Gallant from Space Canada, Professor Barbara Orser from the University of Ottawa, and Pat Dalzell from Bruce Power. Please join us for that. I'll ask Indira to close us out, but Minister, thank you for joining us today. You joined us a year ago at the annual conference, and I want to tell you that regardless of what portfolio you are in, we would like to invite you to our next annual conference a year from now. Because this has been a fascinating discussion. I think it really, the issues we've talked about go to the heart of how we rebuild the economy going forward. And if I can use that word, in a just way.
Oh yeah, of course.
I think people are looking at fair, fulfilled lives, and I think that you are really at the core of all that happening. So thank you, and all the best to you in your work.
And thank you, Andrew, and thank you to everybody who contributed questions too.
Great to speak with you today. Thank you for sharing your insight on such an important file, and I know it means a lot to Canadians in terms of our future to make sure we get this right. And it seems like there are a lot of important initiatives underway. So thank you for your hard work.
Thanks, Indira. Thank you both.
All the best.
All the best to you.